So I'm Lisa Kijuk with the Willistown Conservation Trust, which is a local land trust that manages about 20,000 acres of conserved, well, you know, land, 13 or 14,000 of which is conserved. I should know those numbers better. I've been deep in birds lately, so forgive me for not getting all the stats right. But you know, we always wonder why a land trust is so involved with bird conservation. And I am, oh, Blake's here too. Hi, Blake. The bottom line is, I don't know if anyone watched the David Attenborough interview on 60 Minutes. And if you haven't, please do. You can look it up on YouTube. Best 13 minutes you're going to spend in a long time watching the great Sir David Attenborough, who's 94 years old, has traveled the world since he was 22 years old with the BBC, and really has seen the decline that we talk about in conservation, this decline of species worldwide. And he's just amazing. He came out with a new video that is available on Netflix, and it's worth your while. And the takeaways from that are, you know, the wildlife is declining rapidly. Humans are really doing a number on the native habitat, on species, from insects on up the food chain. And so, you know, Willistown Conservation Trust is trying to do our part. We were lucky enough to get involved with this Motus project, which kind of reaches beyond our boundaries and beyond our borders. We're meeting tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. with the area of Guanacaste Dry Forest Program in Costa Rica. And so we are now helping Costa Rica and Central America, you know, put up Motus stations, thanks to our very own Pennsylvania Game Commission. So we've just been, if you save land, which is what the core mission of Willistown Conservation Trust is, you know, Bonnie saw this 40 years ago when she started this organization. You really can make a difference and save species. It's the only way, honestly, at this point. And so that's why land trusts are so important. We have Debbie Beer from Natural Lands, which is a regional land trust. We have, you know, we work with Brandywine. We're in this together, I always say. And it's just amazing what people do if we all work together as a team. And that's what Motus is all about. And that's what Willistown Conservation Trust land conservation program is all about. And so that's really what we're here for. So I'm going to turn this over. We have, I thought it would be neat to look at the human perspective for a change. We're always talking about birds and species, and we are going to talk a little bit about that. But I have two fantastic humans here that we're going to feature this evening. One is Shelley Eshelman. She joined us in July, and she's our new Motus avian researcher. And she's going to talk about her trajectory, her life trajectory. How do we get here? You know, and why the heck are we doing this? I ask myself that all the time. It's a healthy question to ask yourself. Why are you doing what you're doing? So she's going to tell you why she's doing what she's doing. And then Zoe's going to follow up, who recently got her PhD, not so recently, but a few years ago. And she worked specifically in Southern Chester County on grassland management. And so we're going to go from the human side then down to the species side, and end with a little special talk about bobolinks, and then we'll have some questions. So I'm going to turn.
But yeah, so just to give kind of an overview of what we'll be talking about, let me see. So we're going to talk about how my early career jobs led me to working at the Trust, and then some current Motus projects that are happening in 2021 and then continuing into 2022. And the reason why I'm really excited to talk about this is because when I was thinking about careers and kind of contemplating what I would like to do, I thought about biology and what I could do with it. And I didn't have a great example of what a career path in biology or conservation and biological research would look like. And so I'd like to provide an example of that for young people. And if you have any questions, definitely ask me at the end of the presentation. So I'm originally from Eastern Pennsylvania. I grew up in Lancaster County, so you're probably familiar with the county because it's known for its Amish and Mennonite populations and gets a lot of tourism. and it also has beautiful farmland. But then, oh, and excuse my cheesy graphics. I was trying to keep it kind of fun and interesting since it's an evening talk, but they're kind of cheesy. So in 2010, when I graduated high school, I went to the University of Pittsburgh to get a degree in biology. I thought that I wanted to head in a pre-med route, and then in my junior year, I took a conservation field course, and it totally changed my perspective on what I wanted to do as a career. That course was taught by Dr. Stephen Latta, and he just provided a great example of all of the things that you can learn from bird species, and just a variety of questions that you could ask. And from then I knew that I really wasn't that interested in pursuing a career in the medical field, and that I really wanted to pursue biological research. And so I was looking for jobs in and related to biology and conservation. And that led me to move from Pennsylvania in the University of Pittsburgh over to Washington, D.C., where I joined an organization called the Student Conservation Association. This is a national-wide organization, and in that role, I led teams of high school students to restore their native parks. And these were students that were from the city. They often didn't have a lot of exposure to like camping or even the local green spaces within the city. And so we would go and we would do restoration projects. As you can see here, we would restore culverts to maintain water levels in some refuges. We would also build some bridges to help paths through areas that had been flooded by water. But we also, this picture on the right shows a group of students that I took to tour a fish hatchery. And so it provided some really neat opportunities to engage with students and teach them about biology and just getting outside essentially. And I really liked the outreach component of the work that I did with the SCA. But I knew that I wanted to get deeper into research. And so after that job, I ended up moving from the DC area, and I actually traveled to the Dominican Republic, which was a nice change of scenery. I definitely liked the beauty of the island over DC. And I was able to join this really great research group that was studying Hispaniolan woodpeckers there. Carpintero means woodpecker in Spanish, and I learned some really great skills. I learned technical tree climbing, and we would use that to scale palm trees and actually inspect the nests and band some nestlings. I also met a lot of really great people and learned about observation skills, like we would observe the breeding pairs and see a little bit more about the life history traits of this species. There's not as much known about species from the neotropics. It's been understudied compared to more temperate researched places in like the US, for instance. I also, Lisa was mentioning that we're partnering with a group in Costa Rica to build a Motus tower there. And in the picture in the bottom left, with our group eating dinner, I actually met Holly Gerard, who's going to be kind of helping to lead that project from the Costa Rican side. So it's a small world when you get into bird research. And I really like that component as well. So from the Dominican Republic, I traveled back then to Pennsylvania, and I actually went back to the Pine-Matuming Lab of Ecology, which is where I took that first field course that really sparked my interest in research. But this time, instead of being a student, I was working as a research technician with a group of biologists that was led by Dr. Sarah Beavis and Dr. Blake Jones. And their main question was how the role of a stress response in a bird influences its success as a nestling. So you might be familiar with brown-headed cowbirds. They're obligate nest parasites, which means that the mothers lay no eggs at all. I'm sorry, they lay eggs. They don't build their own nest. And so they'll lay their eggs in the nests of other species, such as a hooded warbler that you can see depicted there. And yeah, the question, it was just investigating if there are differences in the stress response of nestlings of host species versus this brown-headed cowbird to understand why the brown-headed cowbird is so successful and able to adapt to these new nesting conditions that are various. You could have an egg in a brown-headed or in a hooded warbler nest or in like a red-winged blackbird nest, and the brown-headed cowbird does well in both, and so they wanted to know a little bit about how they are that adaptable. And that really, I liked those questions, looking at physiology and how that helped a species be successful. And I was looking for a master's program so that I could pursue a higher degree. And I saw at North Dakota State University, Dr. Tim Greaves and Dr. Paige Klug were jointly hiring a graduate student. Dr. Klug is from the USDA, and she works with birds and agriculture, that conflict that can sometimes occur there. And Dr. Greaves he's a physiological ecologist, so he works with a lot of hormones, and he's interested in like timing of breeding and questions like that. And I really like that mix where it incorporated physiology, but also a very practical application of birds and agriculture and what that relationship can look like. And the species that I studied there was the red-winged blackbird. You are probably all familiar with them, but just in case you aren't, the red-winged blackbird, you see a male on the left here, and it's aptly named because it has bright red epaulets that make it very easy to identify. You've also probably seen them as you're walking along any kind of waterway. They're kind of aggressive and they can be very noisy. And then the female is on the right there. She's a little bit more muted in color, but I think equally beautiful. I really like them. And that's the symbol I've been using to show my transitions. It's a female red-winged blackbird. So I moved from Pennsylvania over to North Dakota. I chose, as that graphic, a wood chipper for those of you who've seen the movie Fargo. Here's a picture of the team that I worked with. It's my technicians and lab mate, and then also my advisor there on the right is Dr. Greaves. And I just like to highlight the people that I've worked with because they're what make the job great most of the days. The title of my thesis was Red-winged blackbird migration distance and its relationship with reproduction. And as I said, I wanted to look at those life history traits and how they relate to physiological responses like preparedness to breed and reproduction. We were looking at this because red-winged blackbirds cause a lot of economic impact in the North Dakota region. They produce the majority of our nation's sunflower, and up to $18.7 million are estimated to be lost in North Dakota each year just from birds eating sunflower seed. So often you have sunflower seed in your feeders. You know that birds love sunflower seed. And in the Dakotas, sunflower crops are ripening just as birds are flying south. And so large flocks will descend on a field and consume a lot of sunflower. So farmers are interested in what influence their population numbers. But from the opposite perspective, we know that bird populations are dramatically declining across a variety of different groups. We've seen that there's been a 3 billion individual decrease since the 1970s, which is like 30% of our bird populations. And then within the blackbird family, there's been about a 440 million individual decrease, which is like 42% of the blackbird population. And that's including other blackbird species outside of red-winged blackbirds, but they've all kind of declined. And you can see grassland birds, which is at the top there of this graph, that they're in the steepest decline. So I think it's really important that we learn about what contributes to both the success and the decline in different species. Just to give you an idea of what my study site looked like, because North Dakota isn't a state that a lot of people have traveled to. I certainly hadn't before this project, and so it's very flat, and we were working in something called the prairie pothole region, which has a lot of shallow depressions that fill with water and are the perfect breeding grounds for grassland birds and more birds that like nice wetland areas. But this is what I expected to encounter during the breeding season in North Dakota. So in early April, as the birds are arriving, I thought that this was the condition they would find. Actually, it was kind of a frozen tundra. It was not a great place to be in early April, but it ended up thawing out pretty quickly and providing good habitat. I just thought it's important to show the difficulties of field work in addition to some of the positive, beautiful scenery. When I was trying to estimate migration distance, I'm just going to give you kind of a brief overview of what I did, and you can ask me more questions if you'd like later. But I tried to measure migration distance in two ways. One of the ways was with a small GPS tag. So you can see that on the right. It's like the size of a dime. It's pretty lightweight, and it fits right on the bird's back. And you can log a certain number of points throughout the year. And you preset those points, and typically I was getting about 50 points from a tag that worked well. But to get data from those tags, I had to catch the bird originally. Then I would release it, and I had to hope that the bird made it to its wintering location successfully, stayed healthy throughout the year, came back to the same location, and that I was able to capture the bird again, and that the tag hadn't been damaged at all throughout that whole year. And then I would download that data and see what the points told me about where the bird had been. Because those tags are very expensive, we deployed about 30, so we wanted a larger sample size than what GPS tags could give us, so we also would take claw samples and get what's called a stable isotope ratio. Essentially, stable isotope values of hydrogen, I know this is going back into chemistry, but these stable isotope values of hydrogen, they vary with different latitudes. And so as you go farther north, those ratios change based on precipitation patterns. And when birds are at their southern wintering location, they are eating and drinking and taking up those isotope ratios, and it's held in inert tissues, the tissues that aren't really changing, like their claws. And so when they first arrive back to the breeding season staging area, we cut a small clip of their claw, and we're able to measure their stable isotope ratio from the winter and estimate their overwintering latitude. So it gives a broad idea of where they had spent the winter as far as latitude goes, and a larger sample size. And then we had more discrete points from our GPS tags, but because the GPS tags need to be recaptured, we actually only got 5 tags worth of data, which was kind of frustrating. Our blackbirds destroyed the tags essentially throughout the year, was our issue. But while I was kind of lamenting the struggles of some of my tracking methods for birds, I ended up seeing some info about Motus, and I learned about the Motus work that's happening here in Pennsylvania. And I thought, as a proud Pennsylvania native, I was telling my advisor in North Dakota, like, look at what people in Pennsylvania are accomplishing with this tracking system. So Motus, if you're not familiar with it, there are towers that are set up from, across North America. and across the world even. But as a bird flies by a tower with a Motus tag, it's able to log that that bird was there, and then the tower, you're able to gather data from that tower, and it's shared online with anyone that's working with that group. And so after I finished my degree, I moved from North Dakota back to Pennsylvania, and I was looking for positions and places to work, and I saw that the group that had been building this beautiful Motus array that I wanted to have in the Midwest, I was very jealous of it because there wasn't a version of that in the Midwest where my birds were flying. I saw that they were located right here in Eastern PA, and I was able to contact Lisa and begin working with the team through the Motus group, which I just loved and could go on about. But so this summer, Lisa mentioned July 1st, I joined the team, and one of the first projects I got involved with was building some of these stations. I wanted to give you guys some visuals for those of you that haven't seen many of the towers. On the left is an example of a tower where we used a lift to work on a tower that was attached to Utica Zoo in New York. The center picture shows a pop-up that we put in a field, and then the right shows a version of the towers where we build them on a building. And so there's just a variety of ways that these stations can be assembled, and there's just a brief overview of some of them. But we've also put up stations at Lake Ontario. So there's some beautiful views while we're assembling these. I was able to go help repair a station with one of the collaborators, Dave Brinker, in Assateague. And so when you're working and you're able to see wild horses on a beach, you know you have a great job. It was so wonderful. And I've been able to learn a lot from each of these people and sites that we've worked at. So over the summer, we've put up, I think, 19 stations so far, and there's 6 more that are going in. Lisa mentioned that we'll be placing, a station at Bill Elkin's place in just a couple of weeks. And so I'm just amazed by what the group has accomplished in just such a short amount of time and in such a difficult year. But I also thought you guys should know some Motus must-haves, what we find essential during our trip. So there's a variety of tools. I didn't know, I've just learned so many different construction words and how to use so many different tools that I had never used previously. I've never soldered so much. It's been a great learning experience. You also have to have Gatorade. Lisa's always telling us to make sure that we stay hydrated. Coming from a North Dakota summer to a Pennsylvania summer, I did not miss the humidity at all while I was gone. It was a harsh reality check when I came back and had to learn what it's like to work in the heat again. And then a headlamp, because sometimes these installations go pretty late into the night and you need to make sure you have light as you're finishing things up. And you also need to have great people. I've worked with really wonderful coworkers. This is John and Mallory are on the left there from Carnegie. You guys are probably familiar with Todd. He's now working in New England, and they've just taught me so much this summer, and I really appreciate them. And also, we have to thank all of our partners. We've met some wonderful people. We've had people that have just really welcomed us and been great partners. But then I wanted to follow up. So I mentioned some of my blackbird work that I had worked on. So they're in the family Icteridae, and the Zoe is starting a project looking at bobolinks, which are also in that same family. So right when I was joining, I was able to join in and help out with some of the work that she's been doing. And I'm gonna let her fill you guys in on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Shelley. That was really great. As Zoe's getting prepared to share her screen, I'm sure you all noticed Shelley up on the tree as Joan Swirsky did in the Dominican Republic. And yes, we did ask her if she knew how to climb when she got the job, when we were looking at her for the job. So you can see how all those experiences in her life brought her, you know, full circle. So it's very, very interesting to see how somebody's career transpires. And again, this whole Motus project is giving a lot of work to young people globally. So it's real important to have people like Shelley coming out of school and having this opportunity. And so Zoe's ready to go, and she's gonna take us to the next level here. Thanks, Zoe.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, Shelley. That was great. Speaking of working with teams, it's been just such a nice work environment to be working with Shelley in the field. And so actually the origins of this project started about 6 years ago when I was doing my dissertation research. And so the title of my my dissertation was Influence of Landscape, Spatial Patterns, and Land Use Planning on Grassland Bird Habitat Occupancy in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And basically that means I wanted to see how does the landscape and also land use planning influence where you might find these 6 species. Oh, okay. And the reason I wanted to focus on grassland birds was, as Shelley said, grassland birds are actually experiencing the steepest decline among all bird guilds. And this is related to habitat loss and landscape fragmentation. But really in the last 60 years, it's been changes in land management. And so what's happened is we've had increased mechanizations on farms, and also the timing of processes has shifted so that mowing is often occurring during peak breeding season. So my goal was to use field observations and landscape data to start to see if we could predict where we would find these birds across the landscape, which would help us make land use decisions and management decisions. So I looked at a 300 square mile area in southern Chester County that's right in that agricultural belt of Chester County. And the other thing that I was really interested in was there's a large swath of preserved land in that area. And I wanted to see if having that preserved land influenced where these birds occurred. So I conducted 468 surveys in 145 patches across that agricultural belt. And I was just tickled to find that these birds are there, because when I first set out, I didn't even know if we'd have these grassland birds there. So they occurred in 78% of the patches that I surveyed. And they used the landscape differently. So some of the more generalist species could be found across the landscape, and other ones that had more specific habitat requirements could only be found in the hayfield areas of the county. So using the observations and data that I had gotten, landscape data that I had gotten, the picture started to emerge that there's certain factors that influence where you find all 6 of these birds. And one of them is having a large interior area. So having less edge in a patch is important, because on the edges is where these birds are most susceptible to predators. So these birds are often called area sensitive, which really means they want big, wide open spaces where they're not going to get caught by some predator coming along. Another factor that was important was proximity to other grassland habitats. So if a patch was isolated, it was less likely to have one of these species there. But if you had what's kind of called clumpiness, where a bunch of these patches are in the same area, that's a factor that helps to predict where the birds are. And so that really ties back to land preservation. And if we can preserve large contiguous areas of land, it is beneficial to wildlife. And type of vegetation was also another factor that was used for prediction. So coming away from that, the sort of the big takeaways I had were, one, became very obvious, is that land preservation is very important, and we need to maintain these agricultural uses that allow these birds to use the land. And the other thing was just that changes in land management could really do a lot to boost these grassland bird populations. So shifting mowing dates away from peak breeding times, and also linking agricultural goals to grassland bird conservation. So as I said, I studied 6 species, but really the one that always was just so special to me was the bobolink. And so that's why I'm just thrilled to be a part of this project. So just to give you a little background on the bobolink, they're omnivorous. They eat in the summer when they're nesting, they eat insects and spiders and weed seeds. And then when they overwinter in South America, they eat rice and other grains. And so they use these agricultural lands because they breed in wide open spaces. They breed across the northern US and southern Canada. You can see on the map that pink area, those are the areas where they breed. And they build these tiny little nests on the ground at the bottom of these large hay fields. So they're very, there's a lot of camouflage with the tall grasses, and they build them right on the ground. And from the time when the eggs are laid until they fledge, it's about 25 days. And one of the interesting things about bobolinks, and sort of an influential in their natural history, is their long migration. So they have one of the longest migration routes, and they travel over 12,000 miles annually, moving from Central South America up to their breeding grounds. And so their migration is actually linked to a natural history mystery, the mystery of the molt. Historically, a lot of European naturalists, when they would encounter male bobolinks at different times of the year, they thought they were 2 separate species. So on the left, that's the male bobolink, and on the right is the female. And over time, at the end of the summer, the males actually do a complete molt, and they look like the females. They're indistinguishable from the females. And so this complete feather molt is unusual, and it's actually related to their long migration. They actually have 2 full summers. They have their summer in South America, and then they have their summer up here. And that's a lot of solar exposure, and it can be damaging to their feathers. So they have to replace all of those feathers twice annually. And there's only one other North American species that has a complete feather molt, and it is Franklin's gull. So only 2 species do this, which makes them unique. So getting to finally this summer, what we did, we had the opportunity to do a bobolink study in the area where I had started my research. And this was different. When I was doing my dissertation research, I wanted to know what was happening across the large landscape. But it gave me some insights, but one thing that I missed in how I conducted my research was that I didn't get to know individual populations, and I didn't get to see the different phases of their breeding while they were here in the summer. So this was an opportunity to really look at 2 local populations and see what activities they engage in and how things progress throughout the 3 months that they're here. So we were very fortunate to work with 2 wonderful landowners, and one of them is here tonight, Bill Elkins, and he owns Buck Run Farm. The other, Dee Dee Matz, who owns Buck and Doe Farm, wasn't able to join us. But their farms are located in the old King Ranch area of southern Chester County, and this is the area where there's large hay fields. And so we followed 2 populations through the course of the summer at these 2 farms. So I met Shelley in the beginning of May, and we loaded up our stuff and went out to the field, and we were happy to see that the males had arrived by the first week in May. And we noticed that there were sort of two groups of males. There were males that were separated and they looked to be establishing their territories, and then there was a large flock of males that was not exhibiting any aggression towards each other, and they were really still within their migration route, and they were moving to their northern breeding grounds. So by the second week of May, the females had arrived. The males come first and then the females follow. And with the arrival of the females, we noticed some different activity. The males were still defending their territories, but they were also engaging in courtship displays, chasing the females and trying to entice them into to making a pair, to becoming a pair and mating. So by the third week in May, we noticed that more females had arrived, and because their plumage is cryptic, we don't see them as much. The fact that we were seeing more of them also meant that they were most likely more active in the fields. And we saw one female carrying nesting materials. So we knew that the pairs had been formed and they were getting ready to welcome their young chicks. So we knew that this would probably be an opportune time to try to actually band the bobolinks. And so we had our handy mobile field station, which is also known as the back of Allison's truck, which has all of the tools that we needed to band. And we had quite a time getting these two birds. We learned a lot about how grassland bird banding is different than banding in the woods. So the bobolinks would come up to the net, look as if they were going to fly in, and they would just fly backwards. Or they would just perch on the poles and watch us as we waited for them to get into the nets. But we were lucky to get these two birds, and it's special to see birds up close, especially when in field work, a lot of times you're observing birds from a distance. So when you get them in the hand, you can really see their unique plumage and just have a different perspective on them. And then the next big moment for us was finding the nests at both Buck Run Farm and Buck and Doe Farm. And so to get a sense of how elated we were to find these nests, that's a picture of Shelley and I searching through this sea of grass to find these little nests on the ground. So nest searching was also another challenge for us. But the big payoff was seeing the little babies in the nest, just gaping hungrily, waiting for some form of food to come their way. And so that was early in the week, and then later in the week we came back to find the nest. And what had happened was another nest that had babies, that once they are old enough to get out of the nest, they'll hop out and they'll start walking around within the territory of their parents. So we noticed that in one territory we saw a male and female carrying food, and they would go out, get an insect and come back and find the babies within that territory and feed them. So we knew that the babies were well into their early development. So then in the third week of June, the babies had actually started to take short flights. They were able to not just walk around on the ground, but they would come up and fly a little bit and then go back down. But at that time, we also noticed that the numbers of bobolinks in the field at Buck and Doe Farm had increased. And so this is a high mow time in that King Ranch area. So a lot of the fields in the area had been mowed. And so our thought was that this served as, the Buck and Doe Farm served as a refuge for these birds who were no longer able to use the surrounding habitat. But these birds, the young that were born there, were still in an early development stage. And it really took until the next week when we observed them, the juveniles taking short but sustained flights. Their mobility had increased tremendously in that 1 week span. And we could see males chasing juveniles almost as if it was sort of a training flight for them. And the numbers of birds was still very high in the field. So we saw 2 to 3 times more birds than we had seen during the breeding time. And we would see groups of males together, which indicated that any aggression or territoriality had gone. So whatever success or lack of success they had had in breeding, that was finished, and they were now on to the post-breeding phase. So it was at around this time that the fields at Buck and Doe Farm were mowed. And so we had gone to Buck Run Farm several times in July in the past few years. And our guess was that that would become a staging ground where the birds would go and fatten up and just eat and train to fly and congregate in preparation for migration. And so what we learned was that Buck and Doe Farm is kind of at the bottom of a hill and Buck Run Farm is at the top. And the birds that had been at Buck and Doe Farm kind of leapfrogged along the fields until they got up to Buck Run Farm. And this is really a refuge because there is no mowing there. They mow with cows. So towards the end of August, they bring the cows in and then they keep the vegetation low. So we had now moved into the post-breeding phase. And so for the next 6 weeks, we would go out and check our birds and see what was happening. So for about 6 weeks, there was a mixed age flock, and generally we would count about 50 birds. And we also noticed that they were singing less frequently. We mostly heard chipping. So that was an indication that the males no longer needed to defend their territory, and the chipping was the communication probably between the parent and the juvenile. And it was always fun to walk through the fields because they would get into those grasses and it would be really hard to see them, and we'd walk up close and all of a sudden we'd flush maybe 20 or 30 birds. They'd fly up together and they would just move over to another part of the field and just settle back in and just start eating away. Another fun thing to do during this period was to see the changes in the male bobolink. So I had said they go through this complete feather molt. These pictures show a male bobolink at about 50% replacing its feathers. But over that 6 week period, the males become indistinguishable from the females and juveniles. And so they're all sort of uniform in their appearance. And then sort of at the end of the summer, by the end of August, on my last visit there, the bulk of the flock had gone, and there were a few straggling juveniles that were left there. And this was something that we had expected. Often the adults will take a very direct route to their overwintering grounds, and the juveniles will take this sort of meandering, circuitous route and end up meeting the adults there. So these straggling juveniles didn't surprise us when we saw them. So the things that we learned this summer was, once again, what we always say is that preservation is so important. Having these lands available is key to bobolink survival and successful breeding. Because if a property is developed, then that means the habitat is gone forever. But the other thing that we learned, and we knew, but it's always so nice to have it reiterated, is that landowner cooperation is tremendously important. We worked with Bill and Dee Dee, and we're so grateful for their interest in the birds. And we also found that small changes can go a long way. So for instance, at Buck and Doe Farm, normally the mowing occurs later, but the mowing was 10 days later, and that was so critical for development. And so the young that were born there were able to take that long flight up to Buck Run Farm. So this year we were actually this was supposed to be a Motus project, but things got a little changed around because 2020 has been such a strange year. So we were lucky to actually make this a pilot season where we really got to know these birds a little better and know their habits and know how hard they are to catch. But next year, we're looking forward to having a Motus station at Buck Run Farm. So actually, it will be installed this fall, and that's at Bill Elkins' property. And then we'll be nano-tagging 10 bobolinks, a mix of adults and juveniles. And then we'll be tracking their movements during breeding and then following them through the Motus array through their migration down to South America. And the other exciting thing that happened for us was that we connected with other researchers who are focused on bobolinks. So Noah Perlett, who works at the University of New England, who's been studying bobolinks for 20 years, we're going to be compiling our data with him and then also with researchers at the University of Maine. And Noah has been just really generous with his knowledge and helping us to figure out how we're going to get these birds in the net next year. And so the things we want to use the data to determine are habitat preferences. A really big one is learning more about the timing and the stages of breeding, because the more information we have, the more we can share with landowners who are interested in working with the birds in terms of setting up when they mow, and also learning about the survival rates of the birds from breeding and then also into migration. So it was a great summer being able to track these birds, and we're really just looking forward to what's to come with coming year. And so I think we're ready for questions.
Thanks, Zoe and Shelley, both of you. That was outstanding. I hope that everyone on this call wants to be a conservation biologist now. That's our hope. I see some young ones looking, and there's Catherine. I think we have one or two out here. And thanks again to all the supporters of the Motus project, which has been so rewarding, not only to hire people like Shelley and Zoe to do this incredible work, but to really benefit conservation and get there quickly. And yeah, and thanks, Debbie. I mean, you can see all the different people. You have Laura Duramel from the Nature Conservancy. You have Debbie Beer from Natural Lands. There's just so many people working on land conservation that's so important.